This week on the podcast, the election of Donald Trump and repression of activists in Singapore. Welcome back to the latest episode of the Green Left News podcast. My name is Isaac Nellist and I'm talking to you from Gadigal country in Sydney.
And I'm Riley Breen and I'm joining you from the beautiful lands of the Whadjuk Noongar here in Bulu, Perth.
Yeah, we've got, we're going to be talking about, obviously, the big story of the week is the election of Donald Trump in the US. And we're also going to be talking about an interview I did recently with an activist in Singapore who's been targeted with censorship over some posts she made on social media. So we're going to get into that soon, but just before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are recording this podcast on stolen land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and Green Left pledges to stand with First Nations people in struggles for sovereignty, justice, and land rights. Also, before we get started, I'd just like to say if you enjoy this podcast and you want to help it continue, please consider becoming a supporter at greenleft.org.au/support. Plans start from just $5 a month, and it's the best way to receive our content and to help us continue producing it. We also just got a little short story. Last week on the podcast, we spoke about the Rising Tide court case in the New South Wales Supreme Court, where the New South Wales Police were taking Rising Tide to court to try and get their Form 1 for the People's Blockade of the world's largest coal port cancelled. Now, unfortunately, just a little update, the Supreme Court did rule in favour of New South Wales Police, and so the Rising Tide's Form 1 has been rejected for the protest, but Rising Tide have made it very clear that they are still going ahead with the blockade. They've made it clear that it's still 100% legal to gather on the beach in Newcastle and to kayak in Newcastle Harbour. So it's all still going on ahead. Just a few things to keep in mind. There's will be less protections from the police. So if the police kind of call you to, clear an area or stuff like that, there's a bit less protections than you normally have at a protest that does have a Form 1. But Rising Tide is on top of all this, and they're posting a lot of information for people who are curious or concerned about what this means for the protests. So check out Rising Tide's social media and risingtide.org.au, and we'll also be continuing to keep you up to date on the podcast and at Green Left website on this story.
Yeah, no, I think if anything, that's probably an even more of a reason to make sure you go, because without that protection, you often need a much bigger mass of people in order to prevent, the police will probably try some intimidation tactics. They might try and move on notices, stuff like that, even though, it's perfectly legal what they're doing. I mean, I actually don't know what the law is like in Sydney, but certainly here I've encountered police abusing these move on notices to try and clear out a protest. So the more people are there, certainly the less they're able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, encourage everyone to still come down, and it's going to be a really important protest. We do need to stop this fossil fuel driven destruction of the climate, and Australia is playing a huge role in that. And this is the world's largest coal port. And so if we can stop coal ships for the 30 hours that they've got planned, and then we can build on that to even bigger and better things in the future. But that's all from that. Let's move on to our next story.
Yeah, so the main one, I think most of our listeners can't possibly be unaware of this, is the Trump election. So, we're not going to go too much into, the this and that of results. You can find that on literally any news site. I will say, just give some quick statistics so obviously Donald Trump won. I think, everyone has seen that somewhere. You can't really escape it at the moment. The actual numbers were that he won 295 electoral college votes to Kamala Harris's 226 votes. I mean, one very notable thing was that it wasn't just, we all know that the electoral college system is pretty screwed up in America and can create, situations where someone can have plenty of popular support, popular vote, but still lose because of the electoral college. That wasn't actually the case this time. Trump won, on the basis of popular support as well as the electoral college, which is actually Like it's scary to say, but it's actually a genuine mandate for his program and his, it shows that there's like at least among the people who turned up to vote, and we'll get to that later, of course, because voting is not compulsory in the US, and that really shapes how these elections turn out. Um, that yeah, at least among those who turned up to vote, he has wide popular support, which is pretty terrifying. Um,
Yeah,
so
people have pointed out like it's a very scary time for, you know, women, obviously with the threats to abortion rights, obviously the threats to LGBTIQ rights in the US. Trump's also said he wants to help Israel finish the job in Gaza. And of course, you know, the rich are going to get richer.
yeah,
That's the kind of how things work.
and just on that actually, so I was at an event here the other day recently, and there were some people from various other socialist groups and various non-aligned people. But somebody from another group sat next to me and started asking me about the US election and said something to me along the lines of, oh, well, because by this point it was already clear Trump was going to win. The results hadn't been fully counted, but it was quite obvious what was going to happen. And he said, well, it doesn't really matter because they're both genociders, they're both genocide supporters, um, you know, kind of equating the two. And I actually don't, I can see why you draw that conclusion because they are both genocide supporters. Absolutely. They have both the Biden and Harris, and I mean, Blinken, admittedly, actually, I think is the one who's been really calling the shots, given that Biden is senile and Kamala is busy campaigning. Obviously they have given completely green light to genocide. There's certainly no opposition to Israel, but I think it's not quite right to draw the conclusion that therefore Trump is going to be exactly the same, because I think at the very least the Democrats had some strategic perspective to trying to limit the scope of the war, the genocide, but also the wider possibility of war in the Middle East and conflict with Iran and Lebanon and all that. And I just don't think that Trump has either the strategic perspective or the restraint or anything like that. So he is just going to give the green light to insanity, I think. As much as what's already happened has been insane, there's been some cold calculus on the part of the Democrats about just how insane they're willing to let it be. And I just don't think we're going to get the same from Trump. So it is, I think it really does spell some dangerous times, more dangerous times, I should say, because of course it's already incredibly dangerous, but much more dangerous times for anyone living in the Middle East right now.
Yeah, I think like obviously the Democrats have been 100% behind the genocide from the start. I mean, Joe Biden talks about how much of a big friend of Israel he is and things like that, and they've obviously been supplying weapons, political support, and billions of dollars. And the thing with Trump is like, when he was president, he was very pro-Israel, and he likely will continue. He has got that level of like unpredictability where you don't know exactly what he's going to do. So it'll be interesting to see, what we're kind of predicting is he's going to ramp up the violence and push it further. But people are also predicting he's going to pull back from Ukraine because he's got these connections with Russia, and there's all these different elements that could be into play. And there's also the kind of impending US-driven war with China that has been continually drummed up by the US. And so maybe he'll kind of see this as a way of, let's stop sending all these weapons to Israel to kill civilians in Gaza. We need them to attack China. So there's a lot of factors coming in, but yeah, you're right that like it's scary. I think one key like indicator of where Trump might sit is the way that Netanyahu responded to his election. He posted on X or Twitter that congratulations on history's greatest comeback. Your historic return to the White House offers a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the great alliance between Israel and America. This is a huge victory.
And not only that, I mean, so actually at the time that the election became clear, this is the event I was at. Was a talk by Vijay Prashad here at our centre, and he pointed out that immediately upon the result becoming clear, Netanyahu sacked his defense minister, who was of course a rabid pro-genocider as well, but he was again one of these people who was just kind of strategically trying to limit some of the scope, try to call for at least a tiny bit of restraint. And, as soon as it becomes clear that Trump's winning this election, Netanyahu sacks his defense minister, replaces him with someone that's even more just, even more just willing to head full first into insanity. And I think that is quite telling that, if that happens as soon as Trump gets elected, that means that Netanyahu knows that he can now get away with much more.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to come back to a point you briefly raised before, which was on the the voter turnout and how many people vote and didn't vote in this election. So it's kind of like, obviously everyone knows the US system, you don't have to vote, unlike here in Australia where it's compulsory. So a lot of what the kind of campaigns have to think about is how to convince people to come out and vote, not just convince them that you're better than the other people, but convince them that it's even worth voting in the first place. And this actually was the second highest turnout in US history in terms of voters. The highest was actually the 2020 elections, which was obviously Trump v. Biden. So pretty high numbers, but still about 100 million, probably slightly less of it, around that, didn't vote. So there was about 72 million votes for Trump, 68 million for Kamala. And I think, it comes down to the fact that, the Democrats weren't really offering anything for working people. And so Trump's obviously playing up the kind of fear mongering around immigration. He's playing up the kind of culture war stuff, and trying to bring in that kind of far right influence. And the Democrats are just kind of saying, oh, well, we're not Trump, so you should vote for us, which is not, it was a convincing argument for some people who had switched on and connected to thinking about politics and stuff, and worrying about things like the makeup of the Supreme Court, worrying about, things like abortion rights and things like that. But for people who are just worrying about, how to get by and their day-to-day lives, that wasn't really a compelling message to get out and vote for the Democrats in any way. And obviously that's not helped by the fact that the Democrats are pushing this genocide the whole time. But I don't think it's fair to say that the majority of people in the US were voting alongside the lines of the Gaza genocide, but it would have definitely had an impact, that's for sure.
Well, I think that's proven by the fact that there was, I forget her name, or I think it was in Michigan, but I forget the exact location, but there was a congresswoman who was elected on a quite popular platform on the basis of a support for Palestine. So I think that shows the appetite is there. And yeah, there is a layer of people who are just completely disaffected, and you can't blame them. That's something I want to touch on actually is, there's two kinds of reactions that you can kind of have to this result that I think are unhelpful. One is what I think one of my comrades referred to as liberal wrist slitting, which is, this complete, just absolute despair that overcomes you. It's like, oh, everything's over. It's all these idiot Trump voters' fault, and, all that kind of stuff. And that's, that doesn't really analyze, well, why did people not want to vote for the Democrats? What did you fail to offer them that, would actually incentivize them to vote for you? What are you, when you have a platform that just gives nothing to the working class, just have, all you have is I'm not Trump. That's just not enough for a lot of people, and you can't blame them for that. And I think that brings me to the other action we can have, which I've seen quite a lot on the more radical left, which is to kind of adopt this very self-righteous attitude towards, liberal voters or stuff like that, and say, this is what you get, and just basically tell liberals who would earnestly support the Democrats because they, maybe don't have the same kind of class consciousness or socialist perspective that we have, and say that, it's their fault. And I mean here the voters, not obviously not the establishment that takes advantage of liberalism as an ideology. It is their fault. And just take on this very smug attitude, like we're better than all these liberals. And at the end of the day, that's just not helpful. Like, our job as socialists is to talk to people and actually show them why liberalism is a failed ideology and a flawed ideology, and why it leads to outcomes like this. And we're not going to do that by just sitting back smugly and saying, "Oh, fuck you, liberals." It's just not helpful. We have to actually convince them, and people don't really respond very well to just being told they're idiots for having had illusions in the liberal establishment.
I just wanted to kind of bring it back to the Australian context with how this kind of affects us. So first of all, Albanese and Wong and these kind of Labor politicians who previously have spoken about how they aren't a big fan of Trump and think he's bad for the US were very quick to line up and say congratulations to Trump. Albanese putting on Twitter that, Australia and America are great friends and true allies, and he said he called him up and congratulated him on his election victory, and playing up like this kind of friendship between Australia and the US being represented as this kind of friendship between Albanese and Trump, and Penny Wong as well saying we're committed to strengthening the long and successful partnership between our countries and advancing our shared interests. Now, I wonder what shared interest she's talking about. I presume she means, the shared interest of upholding capitalism and keeping people in the global south subdued, as that's what she's been doing very well by continuing to support the genocide in Gaza.
And there's a key component of that as well, which really I think becomes obvious after this result, which is the necessity of breaking with AUKUS. I mean, the fact that we're so strategically just locked in with the US, no matter who's in charge of the US, in terms of their foreign policy, and the fact that this, like you said, Albo and Wong just lining up to congratulate Trump because they're stuck. Whoever's in charge with the US, we're stuck with them. We're a vassal state under AUKUS, and so it really it's always been important to break with AUKUS. It's always been a terrible deal, but it is now more than ever. It is just complete insanity that to continue with this foreign policy that locks us in with the US no matter what.
Yeah, definitely. And I know the Greens have called for breaking from AUKUS in response to the results, and obviously a lot of grassroots kind of anti-war campaigners, socialist groups, etc., have been calling for AUKUS to be scrapped since it was invented. And obviously there's a whole range of issues, the billions of dollars on nuclear submarines, obviously just the connection to following the US into wars around the country and not having a say over our own foreign policy. There's all these things, and having Trump as the head of that really puts it in perspective, and I hopefully will kind of give those anti-war, anti-AUKUS movements a bit of a boost. I think there is a certain group of people who will see this kind of result, see the success of the far right in the US, and thinking about how things will happen here in Australia and in other countries around the world, who may be encouraged to get active and start thinking about things more politically and taking action. And I highly encourage anyone who's listening who's feeling that kind of despair, is it really is the best solution is to be involved in something, whether it's a local community project or joining a political party or whatever kind of action you take.
And wink nudge nudge, most cities have a branch of Socialist Alliance. I'll be a bit self-indulgent and plug my own party
Yeah,
there.
joining Socialist Alliance is a really good way to get
But
involved.
even if like I'd rather see people join anything,
I just wanted to mention another couple, like I talked about Netanyahu and Wong and Albanese's tweets, but we've also seen, the other far right leaders around the world, Modi in India, talking about heartiest congratulations to his friend Donald Trump. Look forward to renewing our collaboration, blah, 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 blah. The far right Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, calling it the biggest comeback in US political history and a much needed victory for the world. So you can kind of see there's like this kind of global far right is lining up in celebration of Trump's victory. And it is a victory for the global far right. And I think that's something we have to grapple with here in Australia as we've got the federal election coming up early next year. We don't know the exact date, but it'll be sometime in this first half of next year. And we've got, Peter Dutton, who's been pushing a lot of these kind of far right ideas, leading the coalition. And you could see a similar kind of thing happening in Australia, where we've got these kind of weak, wannabe centrist Labor Party who are pushing further and further right on issues like, obviously, we've talked a lot about the genocide in Gaza. They're cracking down on protest rights. They're not doing anything about climate change. All these other issues, the NDIS, banning kids from social media, all these things could lead to a loss for Labor. And even though nobody likes Peter Dutton, that definitely doesn't have the kind of popularity that Trump has in the US, he could still harness the same drivers that motivated people to vote for Trump in an Australian context to get the coalition into power, which would obviously be disastrous again for people here. But it's pretty clear that no matter who wins in these big elections, and a lot of people, as you said, find it very depressing, or they find it as like this thing that like, what can we do? But no matter who wins, really, we still need to do the same thing, which was the need to keep building independent organization of people, a real kind of alternative political project that actually does stand up for workers, stands up for the environment, stands up for peace, and is based in kind of grassroots, mass grassroots democracy as well. So we need to keep building that no matter what happens with these results.
Yeah, that's a very good point to emphasize, because at the end of the day, the solution to our problems was never going to happen in the outcome of an election. No matter what, like you say, we have to fight. It's just the conditions of our fight are different, but the strategy is the same. We have to build a mass movement. There's no getting around that. Before we move on from this, I do just want to, hopefully we have enough time. There was one thing I just wanted to mention. There was an article in Links. For those who don't know, Links is kind of a sister publication to Green Left. It's just a bit, longer articles, a bit more academic. That's links.org.au. This was by a woman, an American philosopher, Nancy Fraser, who was speaking at a conference put on by Boris Kagarlitsky, who's I believe a Russian socialist. And she kind of analyzed that, within the US particularly, but I think this applies to most kind of Western liberal democracies, there's like these two competing, both unhelpful political formations. One is like this kind of progressive neoliberalism that, the likes of Kamala Harris represented. The other is this reactionary populism that Donald Trump represents. And she said something like, the way to move forward and to actually build that working movement is to try and peel off layers from both of those. So peel off from the progressive neoliberals, you have to kind of peel off the working class, people of color, migrants and try and explain and get them to recognize that the solution to their problems isn't going to be found in liberalism at the end of the day. And the source of their oppression is actually the system that they've been taught or that they've been convinced to support. And in the other case of reactionary populism, we have to, because a lot of that comes out of genuine despair at people's economic conditions, right? They see, fuck, I'm poor, there's, nothing for me. The Democrats certainly aren't offering me anything. Maybe this reactionary kind of thing will shake things up and will give me something. Return manufacturing to the USA, stuff like that. And kind of peel them away from the strongman populist image, and again explain to them that actually their class interests are with socialism and with working class movements and mass movements.
Yeah, I think that's a point. I was just going to mention we have an interview on the Green Left feed with Socialist Alliance national co-convener Sam Wainwright, basically talking about the Trump's election and what it means for activists here. And he pointed out a similar thing that, it's these kind of neoliberal, so-called progressive, but hardcore neoliberal governments like the Democrats, like Labour here, and there's representatives of that all around the world that are paving the way and creating the conditions that allows these far-right figures to thrive. So opposing the far-right, you also need to oppose the neoliberalism as well, and that's why we do need an alternative. And obviously in the US, it's hard for an electoral alternative to compete with the two major parties because of the way the system's set up. People talk about, the Green Party and Jill Stein, who, got a few 100,000 votes, but not enough to influence the results at all. And I will note she got a bigger percentage of the votes in areas that were have more Middle Eastern background people, obviously, who are voting on against the genocide. But that's not going to, like, that alone, running other candidates, and there was other independents as well, is not going to make the difference. And it's the same here. We can't just rely on, let's get a third party like the Greens into government, and that'll solve all our issues. We need that. That's a part of it, but we also need this mass grassroots action as well, and getting people from all across society involved in standing up for what we need as a society. I think, like, kind of finishing up on this topic, there's going to be a lot of think pieces, a lot of analysis and breaking down, what went wrong for the Democrats, how Trump is so popular despite being, this crazy figure. And we're going to be hosting a lot of that on the Green Left website over the coming weeks and months, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll hopefully be interviewing, some US socialists and things like that in the near future. So we'll keep an eye on your podcast feed and the Green Left website for those topics.
Hello, my name is James. I use all pronouns. I am a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and the Young Democratic Socialists of America in Miami, Florida, and Florida International University, respectively. My overall assessment of the 2024 election is that I'd argue that it was a bust for the Democrats from the beginning. They capitulated on key issues relating to the climate crisis, healthcare, trans issues, and student debt relief, and a bunch more. The Democratic failure could have in part been because of the genocide in Gaza. We did see a lot lower voter turnout. Approval ratings of Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party and the current administration among Arab Americans was super low, but it's kind of hard to say. Votes for third parties wasn't really competitive, and had every third party voter in key swing states voted in favor of Kamala, she still would have lost. I think in part it is a right-wing turn in the United States, as well as disillusionment with the electoral system among working class voters. So, although we're facing a very difficult administration for the next 4 years, another Trump administration, I think our key task is the same as it's always been: to continue organizing within and alongside the working class in our unions and in DSA.
So, over to our next topic of the podcast, we're talking about the repression of activists in Singapore. So for people who don't know, Singapore has quite an authoritarian, controlling government, and there's not really any space or room for activists to, take action on important issues. You're not really allowed to protest. There's super severe restrictions. And I recently spoke with Kokila Anamalai, who is an anti-death penalty and social justice activist in Singapore. And Koki is facing potential jail time and fines for refusing to comply with government censorship. So she basically defied a directive under the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, or POFMA, which is frequently used to silence dissent on social media. So this is actually the first time that someone has actually defied one of these directives. And it's quite significant, and it's quite inspiring for a lot of the activists over in Singapore, for someone to be taking this kind of immediate stand against the government.
So could you explain actually what POFMA is, first of all?
Yeah, so basically if anyone in Singapore makes a post on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, whatever, or on their own kind of website, and the government sees it and it's something that they kind of disagree with, they can order you to put a notice on there that says like, this information is false, basically. And so it's kind of, as I read out before, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. It's basically, they frame it as like, we want to protect our citizens from, misinformation, fake news and stuff like that. But in reality, it's used to silence any kind of criticism or dissent of the government. So, they can ask you to either take this post down or post what they call a correction notice, which gives you like basically a statement saying this is not true, this is the facts of the matter that the government has provided. So it's kind of very kind of big brother authoritarian in that way, but they also, it's not officially part of the POFMA legislation, but they often ask people to post an apology as well, if it's and people are kind of pressured to post like apology for posts for this misinformation. One thing I'll note with this case, even though Koki has refused to comply with, now Singaporean government is approaching Meta and like X and asking them to put the kind of POFMA correction notice on the post themselves, so that it's not even about the individual person uploading and complying with the directive. It's now they're circumventing that and going straight to the big media companies. I haven't seen what the actual decision is going to be based on that yet, but it's pretty kind of intimidating stuff.
Yeah, considering the the amount of genuine disinformation and so on that Meta and other companies like it perpetuate, it's a bit of a grim irony, really, that if the Singaporean government can force them to censor genuine truth-telling. Yeah,
exactly. And we've seen Meta silencing like Palestine protests, like,
and Green Left.
And Green Left's Facebook page was deleted earlier this year, or banned, and even like TikTok and stuff takes down content that's too graphic if it's about Palestine and things like that. So it's kind of eerie to like, first of all, you don't want the government to control what you're posting on social media, and I'll little wink towards Albo's social media ban for young people, but you also don't want the social media companies to have a total say over what's true and what's false, because they also have their own agendas as well. Go ahead.
Could I just ask what the post that Koki put up, what did it actually say that the minister was so afraid of that they needed it taken down?
Yeah, so basically Koki and a group that she's part of, which is called the Transformative Justice Collective, posted information about the death penalty in Singapore, which they're part of the Transformative Justice Collective is basically an anti-death penalty group trying to working with victims of, like, family members of people who have been killed by the death penalty, and also people who are facing the death penalty to fight against it, against capital punishment. And they basically had put up a post about one specific case, and that case was, POFMD, as they call it, those posts. And so the Transformative Justice Collective, as a group, as like an organization or a group, they, followed through with the POFMA, allowed the correction notice to be posted, whereas Koki decided on her individual account to not post the POFMA correction.
So just to clarify, this was just basically reporting on somebody who'd been executed under the death penalty.
Yeah, basically reporting on the case of this specific person, and also giving some kind of background information on, why the death penalty is so horrific and unfair. And you can read the full post on Koki's Instagram, which will and social media pages, which we'll link as well. So in response, the correction notice they asked her to post was like paragraphs and paragraphs long, basically saying that, people who are facing the death penalty abuse court processes and things like this, which she kind of said this was all stuff that goes against everything she believes in and campaigns for, and so just couldn't go ahead with posting that correction notice. And so, like, she is, potentially facing jail time, fines for this, and she's faced kind of other similar threats for previous actions, including like a pro-Palestine walk, where a group of people walked a petition to the government.
Yeah, I just on that, I remember, I think it was one of the guests we had for the Eco Socialist Conference talking about how that was kind of a way they get around, because of course, not of course, but in Singapore, as far as I understand, there's just the one place you're allowed to protest, right? And you have to get permission.
Yeah, one park.
Yeah, I think it's called Speaker's Corner, and it's like way out of the way. It doesn't bother anyone. It's just completely your way of, saying, yeah, you can have your protest. Just do it way over there, where it doesn't bother anyone, where it doesn't actually have an impact. So yeah. I remember hearing about this whole, waiting in line to give, hand a letter to get, because you are allowed to hand a letter to your government minister. So it's like, you line up, and it's a bit like a march.
Yeah. Yeah, so there you go. Let's all walk together to hand the letter, and then the government said that's basically a protest march. So we're gonna crack down on you. Other things that happened around this time was they had this anti-death penalty kind of exhibition they were planning. The government also shut down by forcing kind of the venue to not allow it to go ahead. And then they've obviously issued the POFMA notice. But what's kind of inspiring as well is after Koki posted the refusal, her kind of blog post about why she's refusing to go ahead with the correction notice, a whole bunch of people have kind of supported her and posted hashtag #IDefyPOFMA on their own social media pages. And this is like they're directly going against the government's request here and defying the government as well, so they could also potentially face legal threats and things like that. But it's kind of this inspiring kind of collective action, and Koki described it as the biggest online protest in Singapore's history, which is pretty cool.
Well, hopefully it's the kind of thing where it's like, if enough people do it, they can't possibly jail us all, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. And she's this is a quote. She said, "These kinds of collective actions are rare in Singapore. It's an expression of political culture that activists in various movements have been working hard to nurture, given how much fear and stigma there is around dissent in Singapore." So the fact that there's been this collective action, a bunch of people posting this hashtag #IDefyPOFMA, is the result of like a long kind of hard-working process where they've been building up this kind of culture of resistance and political culture, as she said, in Singapore and society, which is very apolitical and as you said, there's no you're not allowed to protest anywhere. It's hard to do any kind of political action. So to kind of create this space that they've created and to give people the courage to stand up to the government it's a victory in and of itself. I just wanted to kind of point out, like, so far the government hasn't really responded to Koki's decision to defy the POFMA, and she told me that that they might not for months or until next year, or because basically they'll wait for the attention around it to die down before they kind of start pursuing the legal the kind of backlash that they'll pursue eventually, because they'll wait. If there's less attention on it, they can get away with more. It'll just become this kind of background story. Whereas if they'd immediately responded, it would have, there would have been headlines and it would have been all in the media, and there would have been more pressure on the Singaporean government. I think,
they're quite savvy in that way. They kind of know how to repress without it becoming a blowback.
Yeah, exactly. They've got a lot of experience in that way. I think Koki described it as the government having a powerful PR machine, and that works all around the world. They convince people around the world that Singapore is this like perfect kind of idyllic society. It's a very kind of rich country, but she pointed out that that it's a rich country, but the wealth isn't distributed fairly or even produced fairly. Like, there's over 1 million migrant workers who produce so much of the wealth, but they barely have any rights. She said it's an authoritarian state where even a one-person silent protest is criminalized. And there's a lot of examples of this online.
My favorite one of that was actually, again, from the Eco-Socialism Conference. I can't remember who gave the example, but I think they talked about someone who, you're not allowed to carry a placard outside of Parliament because that's a protest, right? So someone just drew a smiley face on a placard. It wasn't making a political statement. It wasn't really saying anything. It was just literally just a placard with a smiley face on it, and they got jailed for that. So that really just hammers in just how absolutely authoritarian and repressive and kind of scared the government is, because I think it's a very strange kind of country with a lot of contradictions. I was talking to someone, actually 2 different people from Singapore the other day, about this, and it's like, from what I obviously I've never been there. I don't know anything firsthand about it, but from what I've kind of been told and understand, it's like they get, they're in proximity to the entire global South, and they're a colonized country and stuff like that, but they kind of have this honorary global North status where you're allowed to have travel without a visa to Australia, for example, stuff like that. They're allowed to have a relatively higher standard of living than, say, Malaysia, which is right next to them. But in exchange, the kind of deal they have to strike with the government is this, it's so-called, this idea that it's necessary to maintain the standard of living. We have to have all these authoritarian stuff, it's a country I don't really understand very well, because it's full of just these kind of bizarre things that you don't really see elsewhere, but it's quite fascinating in a different way.
Yeah, and I think particularly in the context of our earlier discussion around the US election, like, I think we as a country here, we focus so much on countries like the US and Britain and the politics that are happening there, and we don't really pay as much attention to countries that are actually in our part of the world, that are our neighbors. And I think, like, as you mentioned earlier, the Eco-Socialism Conference earlier this year was great to meet activists and socialists from Singapore and Malaysia and other nearby countries. And I think that's something that we should try and do more of, and kind of learn more about the what's going on in nearby countries, and kind of extend our support and solidarity, because in a kind of a regional way, because obviously we hear a lot about countries like the US that we have these kind of connections with on a governmental level, but what about on a person-to-person kind of solidarity level? I think it's really great to try and keep up to date with, what's happening in Singapore, what's happening in Malaysia, what's happening in India. And so it was really great to speak to Koki about this, and I think encourage people to check out the Transformative Justice Collective on Instagram. They post fairly regularly about the campaigns they're involved in. Another group is Workers Make Possible, which is a workers' rights group in Singapore, and we'll link those groups in the podcast description as well. Well, that's about all we've got time for on this episode of the Green Left News Podcast. If you liked what you heard today, please consider becoming a supporter at greenleft.org.au/support. We're trying to get as many of our activist journalists as possible to the People's Blockade of the world's largest coal port, which is happening in just a few weeks. So if you can become a supporter or make a donation at greenleft.org.au/donate, it makes a big difference to allow us to continue producing this podcast and the paper and the other work we do. It's only $10 a month to get a hard copy of the paper delivered to your door, and they come out every 2 weeks, and it's filled to the brim with interesting political content and photos and things like that. So definitely consider becoming a supporter.
And I did mention links earlier, and quite often the Green Left copies actually contain inserts from links that you can read as well, which, personally, I actually find that a lot more, I find a lot of those articles very engaging, so I really like to have that in hard copy as well.
Yeah, as Riley mentioned, Links is a sister publication, Journal of Socialist Renewal, International Journal of Socialist Renewal. So that has, as you said, more, academic and longer pieces that go into a lot more depth than you would find in a Green Left kind of news kind of stories. So definitely check that out. And links.org.au. I'll put a link in the description. A links link. And yeah, as we've talked about, make sure to come to the Rising Tide blockade if you're able to. It's 19th of November is when it starts to the 28th. And keep an eye on Rising Tide socials for information about that. You can also find other events and protests, particularly for Palestine and Lebanon, in the Green Left calendar, greenleft.org.au/events. And you can also submit your own events if there's anything on there if there's anything that's not on there that you think should be. I'll give a final shout out to Sean Valenzuela or at Little Archer Beats for the music that you've heard on this podcast. And we'll see you next week for another episode. Thanks for listening.
Bye.